We also got someone else on the line we want to talk to. It's our Dave Campbell's senior college football writer, Mike Craven. I know we do mainly Texas high school football on the show, but Craven just is about to wrap up his summer magazine tour, going through all the Texas colleges and in this state. And I wanted to check in with him after his tour to see how it fared this year. So Craven, we got you on the line here.
Yes, sir. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you, have you joining us on Texas Football today. Craven, I know that spring practices are all about drinking the Kool-Aid, right? We're seeing which everyone's never felt better about their roster. We've never been deeper. We're never been more excited for a year. Who is a team that you're drinking the Kool-Aid for after visiting their magazine stop?
I was probably drinking the Kool-Aid. I may have mixed the Kool-Aid on this one. I've been high on Baylor, this whole offseason and talking to not only just Baylor, but other coaches in the Big 12 at Tech, at TCU, at Houston, and just asking them, hey, who's the team in the state you think is going to be really good? People aren't talking enough about it. And the Bears were mentioned a lot. Return a ton offensively. Sawyer Robertson back at quarterback, Bryson Washington at running back. 4 of their 5 offensive linemen are back. Josh Cameron at wide receiver has been really good. Defensively, I think they added through the portal in places that they needed to get better. Keaton Thomas at linebacker is back. So if the secondary can get, if the secondary can get competent, right? I mean, they don't have to be the greatest secondary of all time, but if the secondary can get good and they're able to find some pass rushers, they added a couple through the portal. I think Baylor is right there with a lot of other football teams in the Big 12 to be a contender. And that's kind of the interesting thing about the Big 12. We could probably name 6 or 7 teams that have a chance to win it, and we probably wouldn't even mention the team that'll end up winning it because it's always a team that we don't expect.
Yeah, last year I'm working on the Big 12 magazine preview for our summer magazine, and Arizona State went from 16 to 1st last year. So we'll see what happens this year. It's always a toss-up. Craven, I know you love talking to Dave Aranda, the head coach of the Baylor Bears, and one of the coolest things about these magazine stops is the coaches are so gracious to give us time. Who's one of your favorite coaches to talk to when you go on your tour?
I've known Joey McGuire and Jeff Traylor for probably the longest just because of my history covering high school football and being on the recruiting beat for a long time. So those are easy conversations. They trust me, and so you can get off the record and really talk about some nitty-gritty football stuff. That's always interesting. But I'll go with Sonny Dykes. I've always really liked his perspective on college football. I think he's a pretty straight shooter. He's honest. He's great for anonymous surveys. He just has really good quotes, and he'll tell you what he feels, and he doesn't care too much about the blowback or how it's received as long as he thinks it's true. His dad, obviously Spike coached for a long time in the state, and Sonny kind of grew up around that. So he has just tremendous stories from when he was young and just, being around coaches like R.C. Slocum, Spike Dykes, and those guys. And then, his mentor is Mike Leach. And anybody who knows me knows that I can sit there for 5 hours and listen to Mike Leach stories. And so Sonny's always good for a few of those. I really enjoy my stop in Fort Worth.
Now, I know coaches are more present than ever on social media, on TV, on talk shows, on podcasts. So we feel like we get to know these coaches. But for you gets to sit down with them, no cameras around. Is there any coach who maybe is different than what his public persona is, or any coach that's really interesting, has a fact about him that not a lot of people know about?
We mentioned Aranda. Aranda's probably the most interesting one just because he's so different. I'm going to go with Scotty Walden, actually, in terms of just a coach who's maybe different than the public thinks they are. I think with his demeanor, his excitement with being young, I think a lot of people kind of see him as a Boy Scout, and Scotty Walden will get on you. I was there last year for their kind of first team meeting when they, revealed the new locker room to the players and kind of had their introduction to the fall. And he uses colorful language. He gets loud. He talks about, beating teams on the other side of the field. He is not kind of the Boy Scout I think a lot of people probably think Scotty Walden is just from the outside. He's a fiery, excitable football coach who's competitive. And, that's why he's risen up the ranks as quickly as he has.
All right, we've talked about the coaches. Let's kick it over to the players. Now, who is the best player in Texas? And of course, y'all, this is subject to change because Craven will have the Lone Star 50 coming out in the summer. But after your magazine stops, Craven, who do you think is the best player in Texas?
It's probably one of those defenders at Texas, either Anthony Hill at linebacker or Colin Simmons at defensive end. Anthony Hill is going to be a probably top 15, 20, draft pick this next year when he's able to get in the draft. The 5-star prospect can't miss out of Denton Ryan, and he's fulfilled all of that. He's been a great edge rusher early on in his career when that was his role. He transitioned to kind of a traditional linebacker last year and was excellent at the second level for Texas, a really good leader. I think he's going to be a 10, 15-year NFL vet, make some Pro Bowls. He's going to be really good. Colin Simmons would probably be my pick, though, just because of the positional importance. Like, you can't teach guys the pass rushing ability that he has. He's just an absolute demon. He's a freak of nature. We've watched him a lot just at his time at Duncanville and state championship games, and he was always the best player on the field in those North Shore Duncanville state championship games, and there was usually 30 guys that were going to go play college football there. So anytime you can be an elite level pass rusher who's probably going to be like an Abdul Carter type prospect coming out of the NFL, I think you're there. And then Michael Taft maybe in the second and the third level, a former walk-on who his story is well known, but a really good football player and excellent safety, and one of the reasons Texas defense was so good last year.
One of the things you said about Colin Simmons was that he always plays his best in the biggest moments. And you mentioned the Duncanville North Shore games, how he's always the dog on the field in a field full of dogs, right? There's like 30 guys going to play college football. Also saw he's switching to number 1 from number 11, and his quote was, "Because I am the one." So he doesn't lack for confidence. He plays like that too. All right. So those are probably the best players. Who do you think is one of the most underrated players that people aren't talking about, like Anthony Hill, Colin Simmons, Michael Taft, but could ascend to that later?
I'd probably take linebacker Jacob Rodriguez from Texas Tech. And if not him, maybe linebacker Keaton Thomas from Baylor. I think in this state, Anthony Hill and Torian York at Texas A&M get most of the headlines at linebacker. They get a lot of the talk, and they should. Really good high school players. Played a lot as true freshman. York's already a 2-time captain at Texas A&M, and I think he's just now 21 years old. But Jacob Rodriguez, Keaton Thomas are ultra productive linebackers who are all Big 12 type players. Bringing Jacob Rodriguez back, I think, is a victory for NIL. We kind of talk about NIL a lot as the boogeyman, but for some players, it's allowed them to play an extra year or two of college football where they don't have to make that choice between being a broke college student and going and getting paid in the professional level. They can get paid and play at the college level, maybe take another year or two of development if they're, a mid to late round draft pick. And, at Tech, I think historically, we always talk about the offense. Last year, the defense was really bad, which is why, they made a change at defensive coordinator in the offseason. But Jacob Rodriguez and that linebacker core in general is really good in Lubbock. I think he's going to be really good again.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Jacob Rodriguez gets to stay there because Texas Tech has their NIL game figured out. They've also spent $10 million in the transfer portal to revamp that defense. It's gotten plenty of national headlines, that and their $242 million football facility with a players lounge, a podcast studio, and a hydrothermic chamber or something. It's insane. You went there, you saw it. But that's gotten a lot of national attention. What's a storyline that isn't getting a lot of national attention, Craven, that you think people should be talking about more?
We talked about Baylor being a Big 12 contender. I think another one who could surprise folks is TCU. Like they're the team I think is maybe the most underrated in the state. Like if you look at the Vegas win-loss totals, like the team totals right now that you can bet on, not that I've eliciting gambling here, but
of course not.
If you were to gamble, I would go TCU over on that. Like the win total of 6.5, I feel is low. Third year with their offensive coordinator, Kendall Briles. They bring their quarterback back. They really like the skill around him. Offensive line mostly intact. Andy Avalos in that defense played really well in the second half of the season, started getting some turnovers. I think they were like -10 in the turnover margin at the first 6 games last year when they were 3-3, and then they were +4 the last 7 games and went 6-1. So if they could just stay out of their way and having a quarterback who actually gets to go through the spring this year and is going to be entering his third year as a starter, I think they're going to take care of the football more. If they can find a running game, they brought in Convoy Barnes from UTSA. They think the offensive line is going to be more physical. If they can find a running game to provide balance, you look at TCU's schedule and you can find 8 or 9 wins in there, and that puts you in Big 12 contention. Remember, the 2 teams that played in the Big 12 championship last year were 7-2 in conference. And so it's not one of those where you have to run the table. All you got to do is win the conference, get into that championship game, figure out a way to win, and then you can be Arizona State this year. Sonny Dykes said it's the best roster he's ever had, including that 2022 roster that had 7 NFL guys on it that got drafted. So if it hits, they only took 8 guys in the transfer portal, which I think is a sign that he feels that roster is really healthy, and they've done some solid recruiting behind the scenes. I think the Horned Frogs are poised to be in there with Baylor and Texas Tech amongst the best in the Big 12.
Craven, all the college football coaches talk about how much harder the transfer portal makes their job. And I full-heartedly, and I think you full-heartedly agree with the 2 transfer portal windows. Roster is just in constant flux, right? But we know how it affects college coaches. How does it affect your process writing this magazine?
Well, there's a lot more edits in May. You kind of get something figured out, and then you got to change it. I mean, to pull back the curtain, one of the first things I typically do is the All Texas team, just because those guys are known, they're frontline guys. You can kind of go through and see who the stars are going to be. And I've already had to take a punter off and a kicker off. Mason Shipley, left from Texas State. Sam Houston lost their punter. We'll see if any more of those changes happen. So, you used to have a really good idea going into the offseason who was going to be back, who's going to be there, who's going to be the contributors. And so I start my research a little bit earlier than I used to, and then I do edits later than I used to. And so instead of it being a 2-month process, it's really more of a 3 or 4 month process now with a lot of back-end editing. You rely on the coaches more. You rely much more on the SIDs because when I get done with a section, I typically send it to an SID in mid-May and be like, hey, is there anything in here that's going to sound dumb? Are all these players still here? Are all these players still counted on? That second transfer window really puts a wrench into the plans, but I do think that's a ticking clock, and we're not going to have to deal with that much anymore. From what I know, just talking to the coaches, they feel pretty confident that in the future this thing's going to go back to one transfer portal window, and that's going to be in the winter.
You heard it here first, folks. We at Dave Campbell's Texas Football adapt and overcome. That is Mike Craven, our senior college writer at Dave Campbell's. You can also hear him every week with me on the Republic of Football podcast discussing everything college football in the state of Texas. Mike, thank you for joining us today.
Appreciate you guys. Have a good one.
There he goes. Mike Craven, senior writer at Dave Campbell's Texas Football. Love chopping it up with Mike about Texas college football now that he's wrapped up his magazine tour for that summer magazine.